Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for our event. My name is Julia Chen, and I'm the Activities Director at the Yale Club. I'm excited to see so many of you joining us for our virtual lecture series, where we bring in a live speaker to do a talk and a Q&A that you can participate in from your homes. Today, we are excited to welcome Professor Edward S. Cooke, the Charles F. Montgomery Professor of American Decorative Arts in the Department of the History of Art at Yale University. He focuses upon material culture and decorative arts, especially from the 17th century to the present. His books include Making Furniture in Pre-Industrial America, The Social Economy of Newton and Woodbury, Connecticut, and Inventing Boston, Production and Consumption in the Atlantic World. He is currently writing Material Culture and Global Art History. His public articles and essays range from historical studies to contemporary engagements. Professor Cooke in expanding the field of decorative arts has led to several awards, including the Irish Foundation Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Decorative Arts, election as an Honorary Fellow of the American Craft Council, and College Art Association's Distinguished Teacher of Art History Award. He served as a chair of the department from 2000 to 2006 and from 2012 to 2016. Today, we are excited to welcome Professor Cooke to speak to us on the politics of silver. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Thanks so much, Julia. And it's a real pleasure to have the Yale Club undertake some of these virtual sorts of lectures, nourishment for the mind and for the soul during times that need it in many ways. And I just thought when Julia had asked me to do something, initially I was going to be talking in the library, a little bit more intimate surroundings, but we'll try to do something similar to that effect now. And as Julia mentioned, about a year ago, my book on inventing Boston, dealing with the late 17th and early 18th century came out. And I thought it'd be interesting to take a chapter from that and talk about silver during this particular moment in time. So there's been an extensive literature on the fluorescence of silversmithing in Boston during the turn of the 18th century, focusing particularly on names and dates of makers, styles of their products, but less attention has been paid to the origins of the raw material and perhaps the deeper meaning of the medium itself within that specific historical context. Scholars have explored the regional characteristics of silver from particular shops or towns, the gifting of silver for domestic or religious purposes, and the role of silver in the refinement and aspirations of the leading classes, but they have been less specific about the ontology of silver and relied on generalities such as its monetary value by weight. Tonight, what I'd like to contextualize the specific meanings of silver within Boston at the turn of the century. Even though silver ore was not a local material in colonial Boston, local shops did make the bulk of the silver work owned there. The structure of the trade consisted of several large shops run by locally born merchant producers such as Jeremiah Dummer, John Coney, Edward Winslow, who employed local youth as journeymen and apprentices to help oversee work or provide additional hands for the preparatory work of flattening sheets, the physical demands of casting, or undertaking routine work. Piece workers, often immigrant craftsmen with specific skills in chasing, casting, and graving, provided another invaluable part of that trade. They were usually hired on an as-needed basis, either providing their services in their own space or else working within the shop of a merchant producer. The structure thus allowed the locally connected masters to draw on kin and familiar networks for commissions and credit, provided a certain flexibility in production as the number of employees could be quite elastic, and accommodated the introduction of new ideas and techniques through the work of immigrant craftsmen. Unlike London and other important British commercial centers, there was neither an assay office to oversee the quality of the material, nor a guild to ensure the proper training and supply of craftsmen. Instead, the Boston silversmithing trade was self-regulating and resilient, dependent upon local standards of satisfactory performance. Plate, as silver was referred to in period documents, thus comprised a local product made from imported materials by native and immigrant craftsmen working together. The silversmiths relied on older silver objects or coins, which they melted down and refashioned, but the rapid expansion of the town's silversmithing output during the period after 1680 raises questions about that very supply of silver that fueled such a growth. The number of documented Boston silversmiths working in the period 1670 to 1690 was approximately 21, quadruple the number of the previous 20 years, then rose again to about 30 in the period from 1690 to 1720. With that many active craftsmen, the need for raw material must have grown accordingly. Yet scholars of colonial silver have focused more on the finished product and have not fully investigated the particular sources of materials that were melted down to sustain this significant rise in active craftsmen. Where did that silver that allowed the expansion of silversmithing in Boston come from? It seems doubtful that there was suddenly a sufficient quantity of old silver in circulation within the community to provide the working material for that large number of practicing craftsmen. This suggests that the more likely source for the expansion of the trade was coins, even though officials at that time and most contemporary economic historians have commented about the lack of specie in the Atlantic trade. However, these officials and scholars seem more focused upon the role of coins strictly as a medium of exchange, not as a raw material with a different sort of value. Instead, we should think about coins as objects to be unmade and transformed into another commodity, either coin or object. The very liquidation of one type of silver object to provide the raw material for another object thus ends up being a significant and meaningful step in its own right. Silver's great importance was its fungibility, as it derived monetary value from its weight or negotiated exchange rate, status and fashion value from its wrought stage, and cultural value from its origins or associations. Coins, finished silver objects, and even references to no longer extant silver objects moved across the spectrum of value within the specificity of time and place. As the third largest port in the English Empire and the commercial center of the Atlantic coast carrying trade, Boston enjoyed particular advantages regarding access to silver in the late 17th century. Much of Northern Europe, including England, had relied on the silver mines in the Harz Mountains of northern Germany, including those in Clausthal, visited by the Bostonian Jonathan Belcher as part of a European trip in 1704. These mines and the plunder of various religious battles in the 16th and early 17th century had provided the raw material for most of New English work in the late 17th century. Across the Atlantic, Boston was less beholden to the European supply chain and was able to take full advantage of its location near the Spanish trade routes at a time when the mines in the Spanish viceroyalties, particularly Potosi in Peru and Zacatecas in New Spain, dominated the world's silver market. In fact, after a slight decline in silver production in the middle of the 17th century, the silver mines in America, especially in New Spain, began to increase their production in the late 17th century. In carrying lesser quality fish and wood products to the Caribbean in return for sugar and molasses, Boston ship captains in the late 18th century inevitably encountered this flow of silver coins and procured small quantities of pieces of 8, the Spanish silver coin minted in New Spain and Peru that was the most universal coin of the colonial period. The flow of this silver through Boston's ship captains, seamen, and merchants led in 1652 to the Massachusetts General Court establishing a mint in the Boston shop of the silversmiths John Hull and Robert Sanderson. Even though the local citizens had no imperial authority to set up a mint, the Boston leadership identified a need for coins in small denominations, 1 shilling, 6 pence, and 3 pence, to provide small change in smaller sorts of local transactions that allowed traders to gather local goods to transship to coastal or Caribbean markets. But it was the informal economy that most likely contributed to the rise in silver materials in Boston, particularly treasure salvage and privateering. At the heart of these endeavors was the annual Spanish plate fleet, which consisted of 2 convoys of Spanish merchant ships and escort galleons that carried silver and gold from the New World back to Spain. One fleet gathered Peruvian precious metals and materials in Portobello, Panama, before sailing off to Cartagena and then to Havana, where they met up with a fleet that had gathered Mexican metal and goods from the Pacific trade in Veracruz. Even the escort galleons could carry around 35 tons of silver, so the total volume of silver in each voyage was significant. For example, the Nuestra Senora de Atocha, which sank in 1622, carried 900 ingots with an average weight of 80 pounds each, and 255,000 silver pieces of 8. Together, the 10 to 15 vessels in one fleet would sail early in the summer from Havana, heading northeast with the Gulf Stream past Florida and then across the Atlantic to Sevilla or Cadiz. These routes left them vulnerable to hurricanes and privateering and warfare. Hurricanes claimed the Atocha in Santa Margarita near Key West in 1622, much of the 1711 plate fleet near Cuba, and the 1715 plate fleet near Cape Canaveral, Florida, while the latter included the seizure of 11 galleons in the Battle of Vigo Bay in 1702 and the loss of several large galleons at the Battle of Cartagena in 1708. Salvage was another important opportunistic means of procuring necessary silver coins and ingots. In 1687, the Boston sea captain William Phipps located the wreck of an old plate fleet vessel that had sunk some 50 years earlier off the coast of Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic. Using grappling hooks, chains, and native divers, Phipps's expedition recovered wrought objects, 32 tons of silver ingots from the vessel's storeroom, and many bags of pieces of 8 from the hold where they had served as ballast. Phipps immediately sailed for England with a cargo valued at 300,000 pounds sterling, from which he drew a personal share of 16,000 pounds. While its total value was significant, the Phipps treasure was not an isolated incident. In 1688, the port records of Boston recorded the arrival of an additional treasure from another site, 39 pounds of pieces of 8, a small piece of silver, and gold bullion arrived on May 9th. And then on June 21st, 13 pounds and 11 ounces of whole and broken pieces of 8 were recorded entering the port. Treasure ships sank with such frequency that even the indigenous people in South Florida salvaged coins and silver from the Spanish wrecks of the 16th century to fashion jewelry. Illegal trade, privateering, and warfare also accounted for the acquisition of silver. In the late 17th century, many Spanish colonists in the Americas grew concerned that the crown, in desperate need of cash, might seize private treasure and offer worthless notes. They therefore began to allocate some of their precious metals to illicit trade with English and Dutch merchants, who provided goods for better prices than the same products that had been shipped through Spain. This leakage of Spanish silver within the Caribbean also attracted interest among the English government. From the mid-17th century through the end of King William's War in 1697, England encouraged, through commissions of sea captains, private men of war to engage in illicit trade and plunder, when appropriate, Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. Based primarily in Port Royal, Jamaica, these privateers or buccaneers were able to sought various commercial opportunities under the premise of national legitimacy. But their primary purpose was to chip away at and undermine Spanish Catholic power, particularly by seizing precious metals mined in the Americas and bound for Spain. Not only maritime corsairs, they waged land campaigns as well as boarding ships. The most famous privateer of the period, Henry Morgan, aka Captain Morgan, conducted a series of raids in the 1660s, the most successful of which was his 1668 siege of Portobello, the gathering port of the Peruvian treasure fleet. From this important port, he carried back to Jamaica 27 bars of silver, silver coins worth 40,000 pesos, silver objects worth 13,000 pesos, and gold coins worth 4,000 pesos. These coins and bars then were recirculated through the Anglo-American trade routes. The War of Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 and continued until 1713, provided another opportunity to cripple the economy of Spain, establish more stable British colonies in the Caribbean, and direct silver coins into British and Massachusetts pockets. In addition to destroying Spanish naval and military strength, the British forces always kept an eye out for silver. In the 1702 attack on Vigo Bay in Spain, when Admiral Cooke seized 11 Spanish galleons, there was considerable attention devoted to the seizure of silver and plate, even from the bottoms of the vessels that had been burned. Not all of this silver was sent back to London, though. Small bits were portioned out as rewards, and some were kept illegally. Even with the final conclusion of the war in 1715, silver remained a central focus in the Caribbean as the next decade witnessed the rise of lawless pirates who operated as individual treasure seekers, robbing ships regardless of nationality, and then using the stolen coins to purchase goods. While Massachusetts government officials may have lamented the lack of specie in circulation, and merchants relied on credit and promissory notes to fund large-scale purchases from London factors, silver coins did flow into Boston during the period from the 1640s through the 17 teens, especially in the last quarter of the 17th century, but they were not officially accounted for. Much of the silver was not thought of as specie for circulation, but rather as a raw material potent with political symbolism. Seizing Spanish coinage certainly satisfied the English Protestant desire to destroy the Spanish Catholic Empire through commercial encroachment and economic destabilization. But the liquidation of the Spanish silver into something other than coins provided additional local value beyond basic monetary exchange. Melting and remaking of precious metals took place within specific social contexts and allowed for the creation of new symbols for another community's unity. In this way, Boston silversmiths practiced a form of reverse colonial appropriation in which a colonial port blended the melted materials of one empire and the filtered fashions of another to create a distinct local hybrid. In Boston, the liquidation of Spanish minted coins or cast bars was the first step in an Anglicization of the silver and its subsequent refashioning as a Boston product in an Atlantic world. Many of the silversmiths working in Boston during this period had trained in England. Some, like William Rouse or Edward Webb, had only recently arrived in search of new opportunities. These craftsmen brought with them working knowledge of the latest fashions that was then integrated with local taste, traditions, and desires. Enjoying easy access to the increased quantity of Spanish American silver, these Boston silversmiths thus found an ideal market far from the guild restrictions and hierarchies of London. More importantly, their work removed all visible traces of its Spanishness in the furnace and then reworked it through hammering, casting, and engraving into a hybrid Anglo-Boston piece of silver. Prior to 1880, the emphasis had been upon the production of silver coins rather than silver objects. John Hull, a native Bostonian who learned his trade from a London silversmith, and his partner Robert Sanderson, who had trained in London, established the first Boston silversmithing shop of significance and longevity. They possessed a variety of skills in raising, shaping forms by hammering sheets of metal over a steel stake, casting, chasing, that is using small steel punches to emboss silver, and engraving, cutting into the surface with a burin to create initials or decorative lines. And they were conversant with the latest Dutch-influenced styles, paneled motifs similar to borders of Chinese crock porcelain, tulips, strapwork engraving, and cast Mannerist handles. But often, they did not have the opportunity to deploy their skills and knowledge to the fullest extent. Much of their livelihood was instead gained from their position as masters of the Massachusetts Mint, where they cut dies and stamped out silver shillings and pence that were necessary during this time when the port town was establishing its leadership in the coastal Atlantic carrying trade. During the third quarter of the 17th century, silver's intrinsic value and economic utility as the raw material of Boston shillings and pence prevailed over its symbolic value and social use in domestic objects. The surviving silver hollowware and flatware of the period from 1650 to 1680 is small in number and selectively conservative, characterized by taut surfaces and flat chasing or stippling, with an occasional use of abstract floral decoration. They tended to be small, relatively plain, and primarily of a vessel type. Dram cups, beakers, and caldle cups seem to have been particularly popular, especially the latter form, which became a standard production item that found a ready market as communion vessels for churches throughout New England. To personalize the silver objects, silversmiths oftentimes engraved a triangle of initials, that of the family's surname at the top and those of the husband and wives' given names below. Such a convention suggests that most silver marked certain occasions or anniversaries within a family, and that such engraving served internal purposes rather than external social ones. In the last quarter of the 17th century, the dominant use of silver in Boston shifted from coinage to objects as patterns of trade were firmly established. Silver coins flowed in from the Caribbean, the province began to print paper money in 1690, and the leading merchants and officials sought to use silver for personal objects to solidify their new status. This demand was met in part by a wave of immigrant craftsmen recently arrived in Boston, introducing innovative skills and new fashions learned and internalized in London. New domestic forms, higher relief decoration, embossed surfaces, more realistic floral decoration, and sophisticated engraving characterized much of the work in the last 2 decades of the 17th century. Jeremiah Dummer, who trained with Hull and Sanderson, offered his Boston patrons new forms such as the columnar candlesticks, similar to silver and pewter examples being made in London between 1663 and 1683. These sticks, wrought from hammered sheets rather than being cast, and the emphasis placed on artificial lighting, amplified by a highly reflective material, document the prevalence of new nighttime lifestyles among the merchant and professional classes who entertained one another in the privacy of their homes. On a corner of the base, visible to all, the silversmith engraved the Lidgett family coat of arms, a new way of personalizing a piece of silver that suggests a more outward directed use of the silver. Such a display seems appropriate since Charles Lidgett was a prominent Boston merchant with a keen interest in royal affairs. On the underside of the base were engraved the initials IDE, commemorating the wedding of David Jeffreys and Elizabeth Usher, who was Charles Lidgett's niece. Another innovative form, proof of Dummer seeking a new fashionable market and looking throughout the Atlantic for ideas, was a lobed bowl inspired by Portuguese silver. While the cast handles and triangle of engraved initials drew from his master's repertoire, the large size, the Iberian influence of the swelled lobing along the rim, and the new floral chasing in the lower section of the body all distinguish the ambitions and global perspectives of a Bostonian in the late 17th century. Dummer himself had personal connections to the Iberian trade, that is, sending fish to the wine islands in Portugal in exchange for wine and ceramics. Dummer maintained ownership shares in several ships with English merchants based in Oporto, Portugal. William Rouse, who had trained in the Rhineland, arrived in Boston by 1676. And soon exerted his influence, particularly as an engraver with a full repertoire of more naturalistic renderings of floral motifs. For John Foster, the merchant who built the most fashionable house in Boston in 1689, Rouse made a skillet used to serve sauces while dining at an oval table, yet another indication of the increased emphasis on refined sociability and entertainment among a certain group of the Boston elite. The engraved coat of arms with acanthus mantling on the body reveal Rouse's command of the burin and the new demand for coats of arms as an appropriate communicative form of decoration. Rouse also provided engraving for other silversmithing shops. On the rim of a plate made for the Rawlins family by John Coney on the left, who had trained with Jeremiah Dummer and established his own shop around 1678, Rouse engraved sophisticated floral and cherub motifs, skillfully rendering images drawn from book illustrations and from textiles such as South Asian chintz and English needlework. The carnations seem particularly derived from painted cottons and wrought textiles. Conversant with the translation of these images from his training in Europe, he cut deeply into the silver, combining the long fluid lines of stems with pairs of incised lines on the leaves and petals to create shadows and a sense of depth. His skill is noticeable when compared to a contemporary engraving on a salver or footed plate made by Timothy Dwight on the right. Dwight's engraving is shallower and less confident. He seemed to struggle more with the translation of printed images, in this case, drawn from John Gillam's Display of Heraldry, a guide for the composition of coats of arms, including images within the shield and mantling, that was first published in 1611. The work produced in Coney's shop reveals how he tapped into the expertise offered by immigrant craftsmen. The London-trained Nathaniel Gay likely provided the knowledge and skill to make a Coney-marked sugar box in the 1680s. The undulating high-relief surfaces of the repoussé-chased egg-shaped lobes of the body and the circular discs and texturing of the lid bespeak a new approach to silversmithing, a mannerist one founded on the use of the snarling iron to push the vessel's wall out before using chasing tools on the exterior to define the shape of that bulge. These complex modeled shapes and deep texture closely resemble London examples made in the late 1670s and document the close design connections between the capital and Boston. The function of the silver object to store sugar affirms some of the economic and cultural changes occurring in Boston during this time. It documents the full emergence of the sugar economy in the Caribbean, Boston's central role in shipping wood and foodstuffs to the new plantations in return for sugar, molasses, and Spanish silver, and the incorporation of sugar into the diet of the leading citizens, particularly in beverages such as punch and chocolate. A second London-trained craftsman who likely influenced Boston production was the spoon maker Matthew Mabley, who arrived in early 1684, bringing with him a specialty skill in either steel swages onto which a silversmith hammered a spoon blank to produce shaped handles and relief decoration, or perhaps the skills to make those swages. Mabley introduced a new spoon type that had an egg-shaped bowl, a flat, wide handle, and stamped decoration on the back side of the bowl and the front of the handle end. It was a significantly more unified design than the previous type, which had a shallow bowl and simple thin handle soldered to the bowl. The ability to produce matching spoons easily, the foliate decoration on both sides, and the more substantial heft of these spoons underscored that emphasis on refined private dining seen previously in the candlesticks and the skillet. The continued introduction of new domestic forms and innovative use of repoussé chasing, the engraved coats of arms, and the cast decorative elements characterized much of Boston's work in silver in the 1690s and the early 18th century. Edward Winslow, another Dummer apprentice, began work in this period, and with Coney dominated production into the 1710s. In the early 1690s, Winslow began to produce new forms like a standing salt with classically based gadrooning, achieved through repoussé chasing, perhaps using the talents of the recently arrived London-trained William Cross. The classicizing tendency can also be found in an extremely elaborate sugar box Winslow made in 1702. The contrast with the Coney sugar box is striking. Whereas Coney's featured a swelled body in some areas in which the silver surface is left plain, the Baroque Winslow box features a body in which the material has been pushed and manipulated to the extreme, becoming as thin as foil in some parts of the lid. The hasp is deeply mottled rather than being pierced. The lower body is pushed in and out with gadrooning and fluting as well as leafage. The top has a well-executed floral field, and there is even punch work. The overall effect is visually rich and dynamic, an appropriate receptacle for the new stimulant of the upper classes. The elaborate manipulation of metal in the early 18th century was also found on some of the most spectacular tablewares that supported the social endeavors and leisure time of the merchant and official class. Around 1705, John Coney made a monteith, a bowl used to chill wine glasses in ice water, for the merchant John Coleman. The body of the monteith features gadrooning and fluting, cast and chased decoration along the crenellated rim, an engraved coat of arms, and cast lion masks and handles. The classically inspired work may be attributed to the influence of Edward Webb, an immigrant craftsman who trained in the shop of William Denny in London and arrived in Boston around 1704. A monteith made in Denny's shop in 1702 shares many formal and decorative features with Coney's work and underscores the close connections between London and Boston shops. There was little significant cultural or temporal lag. In terms of specialized function and combination of distinct types of sophisticated workmanship, Coney's monteith embodies the ambitions, the wealth, and the awareness of Boston's silversmiths and their clients. This singular object was meant to awe its viewers, conspicuously display rare wine glasses, and demonstrate Boston's commercial connections to the wine islands. In the first 2 decades of the 18th century, Boston's silversmiths also made chocolate pots, 6 of which have survived to serve that fashionable breakfast drink of the turn of the century, one that had its origins in Spanish America. Characterized by removable finials that permitted the whisking of the beverage into a froth, silver chocolate pots were a very rarefied prop for genteel behavior at this time, since most hot chocolate had traditionally been produced in a copper or brass vessel. One example by Edward Winslow, made for Thomas Hutchinson, the son-in-law of John Foster, features elaborate gadrooning in the body, cut card ornament around the finial, and a very well-rendered family coat of arms. The use of gadrooning in the base and lid, with a smooth reflective surface in between, and cut card ornament links Winslow's work to a chocolate pot made in London by William Charnelhouse, suggesting Winslow might have hired a recently arrived piecemaker to provide the design and decoration. Sugar boxes, monteiths, and chocolate pots, all linked to foodstuffs acquired through Boston's most important period trade routes to the Caribbean and the Wine Islands enjoyed a short horizon of fashionability that underscores the dynamic socioeconomic climate of Boston at this time. Eventually, expensive sugar boxes gave way to simpler sugar casters and then sugar bowls as tea drinking became more widespread in the 1720s, and chocolate pots were replaced by the more widespread teapot. Monteiths lost favor when the British wineglass industry expanded in the 1720s, and the increased importation of bottles of French and Portuguese wine resulted in the arrangement of large numbers of glasses and an ability to refill those glasses. The Monteith had fulfilled its function only when a limited number of glasses were in use. The close ties between London and Boston were evident not simply in the training of the specialist craftsmen, but also through the movement of objects in both directions. Like many of his contemporaries, John Coney imported small silver items, such as the silver tobacco box made in London by a silversmith with the initials LS, which Coney then engraved with a coat of arms of the Jeffreys family, a prominent merchant family in New Hampshire. Although small in scale, the box signifies authority through its use in the leisure time activity of taking tobacco as inhaled snuff, which was considered much more refined than smoking or chewing tobacco, activities oftentimes associated with lower classes. The use of silver rather than brass or copper, and the added family coat of arms. This sort of branding and rebranding also worked in reverse. Captain Walter Riddell of the British Navy, who commanded the man-of-war Falmouth, was stationed near Boston from 1708 to 1709, when the North Atlantic Squadron protected the New England coast from French warships and privateers. While in the area, Riddell acquired a punch bowl made by John Coney and engraved with his familial coat of arms. He considered the Boston work to be of sufficiently high standard that he carried it home to Britain. The plain surfaces of the Riddell punch bowl and its use of a more wreath-like engraved heraldic frame signaled yet another aesthetic shift in the second decade of the 18th century, when extensive repoussé chasing became less valued and exuberant scrolled acanthus coats of arms gave way to smaller and tighter scrolled strapwork frames with pendant bellflowers, even as the emphasis on domestic gentility and specialized forms continued. Coney produced the first teapot in Boston just as tea began to become the most popular form of liquid entertainment. Rather than draw from the heavily embossed tradition of the chocolate pot, Coney seemed more influenced by the taut surfaces and round bellies of ceramic teapots that had become part of the Huguenot aesthetic in English silver. He made this teapot for the Masserine family, presumably Lieutenant Paul Masserine, a Huguenot soldier in the British Army stationed in Boston from 1711 into the 1720s while conducting military and diplomatic missions in Nova Scotia. A Huguenot influence, which also impacted Boston silver during this decade, can also be seen in silver candlesticks made in Boston at this time. One element of this Huguenot aesthetic was the reliance on faceted forms, breaking up the reflective expanse of silver with ridge lines that created geometric units. Craftsmen such as Edward Winslow could either purchase bronze molds from Britain or take a mold of a British stick of either silver or brass to make a pattern model. For the latter, access to casting stand and molding boxes or flasks allowed replication of batches of the same form. Casting, rather than fabricating candlesticks as Dummer had done, made sets of candlesticks more affordable as nighttime entertainment and socialization increased among the professional classes. The faceting of these sticks, furthermore, provided another means of distributing candlelight throughout the dark interiors of the period. Faceting can also be seen on a caster made by Benjamin Hiller for the Dudley family around 1720. In this case, Hiller raised the form as a swelled vessel, then used a hammer to create creases that defined the panels. The top, which was fastened with a bayonet mount, was ornamented with a punch-pierced pattern that allowed the contents of the caster to be shaken out. In the early 18th century, casters were often purchased for private domestic dining in sets of 3. A large one for sugar, produced in the Caribbean, and 2 smaller ones for pepper and cayenne, spices obtained in trade with South and Southeast Asia. A certain aesthetic reticence could also be found in the continued production of certain forms, such as dome-top tankards and porringers. The latter, a type of bowl first introduced in the 1670s, was no longer fashionable in London by the early 18th century. These round-bellied vessels with a single cast tab handle that provided decoration with geometric piercings and a surface for engraved initials continued to be made in Boston for more than a century. While a number of Boston silversmiths made porringers with a wide variety of pierced handle styles, John Dixwell, who trained with Jeremiah Dummer and had traveled to England in 1710 to claim part of his father's inheritance, developed a certain type of keyhole handle that became the signature handle used by all subsequent Boston silversmiths for the remainder of the century. It was likely a specialty product produced by a craftsman with casting talents, either in Dixwell's shop or another related shop, but Dixwell was the first silversmith to use that handle in the late 17 teens. While the types of silver tablewares increased and the styles of the work changed from elaborate Baroque to more restrained Huguenot aesthetic in the second decade of the 18th century, the reliance on engraved coats of arms as the major form of decoration remained constant and is arguably the most revealing aspect of Boston silver at this time. Just as the circulating medium shifted from silver coins minted by a silversmith to paper provincial notes, for which silversmiths such as Jeremiah Dummer or John Coney engraved the plate, the cultural value of silver objects did not arise simply from the weight, the style, the decorative elaboration, or even the social use of the object, but oftentimes from its engraved decoration. The transition from triangulated initials, which bespeaks an emphasis on inherited objects whose meaning and value often followed a private lineage, to coats of arms that are displayed on objects used in the social theater of the parlor, is a telling indicator of an increasingly outward-directed emblem system, not simply to mark personal identity, but to reinforce claims to social and economic status. In Boston, during that period from 1680 to 1720, the social system was indeed constantly in flux as merchants and magistrates sought to claim a specific rank. In England, the College of Arms, established in 1484 to grant and confirm coats of arms, maintained tight control on the use of arms to signal inherited status right through the end of the 17th century. The best means to gain the right to use a coat of arms was through your own descent, marrying into an established family and thereby gaining land or money, or serving the state. In England, as more professionals and merchants sought entry into the lower levels of the elite and viewed coats of arms as a way of legitimizing their new power, the college served as gatekeepers and granted fewer arms. While the embrace of heraldry in Boston might be considered a form of colonial emulation, as a class of ambitious men simply tried to identify themselves as British gentlemen, the actual deployment of it distinguished it as inspired by British practice, but realized in a vernacular fashion. In Boston, there was no College of Arms to maintain order. Just as they set up their own mint, Bostonians thus borrowed or even invented their coats of arms. For the former, they searched for and appropriated a legitimate coat of arms belonging to a British family that might share the same surname, but to which they had no formal right. For the latter, clients turned to silversmiths with engraving skills, such as William Rouse, to develop an appropriate coat of arms that would not be officially registered, but would still look legitimate. Dedicated engravers also arrived in the early 18th century and brought with them familiarity with the latest conventions in heraldic ornament. In 1716, the London-trained engraver Francis Dewing advertised at his Boston shop, he, quote, engraveth and printeth copper plates, likewise coats of arms and ciphers in silver plate, end quote. The engravers were assisted by the publication of John Gillam's A Display of Heraldry, first published in 1611, with 7 editions appearing before 1724. The volume provided the basic vocabulary that the local engraving silversmiths could then adapt and alter to produce new colonial coats of arms that allowed aspiring Bostonians to claim their membership in the local elite. Once again, distance from the imperial center permitted the space in which Bostonians could appropriate English conventions, but establish their own practice to address local needs and desires. Merchants and professionals had the means and motives to mark their personal identities and to proclaim their sense of social and economic privilege. The silversmiths, drawing upon their own training or print culture, had the tools to satisfy this desire. The success of this craftsman-client collaboration can be seen in the continued use of engraved coats of arms as the primary decorative convention for Boston silver throughout much of the 18th century, and the high status of engraving silversmiths such as Jacob and Nathaniel Hurd or Paul Revere. In John Singleton Copley's portrait of Nathaniel Hurd, painted around 1765, the silversmith engraver rests his arm by a copy of Gillam's book, indicating its continued value in Boston. Copley's famous portrait of Revere depicts him poised to begin engraving a coat of arms on a silver teapot, burins laid out in front. The engraved silver inscribed the place of certain families into a specific local history. During a time of considerable physical and social mobility, surname and place became inextricably linked. The silver confirmed relationships among kin and also signaled the importance of those families within the inner circle of other leading citizens. In this way, heraldry provided a visual form of patina, a quality that spoke to rootedness and longevity, in contrast to the showy, time-sensitive fashion system of repoussé chasing in a Rococo style, which tended to imply new wealth. These Bostonians did not want to be perceived as nouveau riche, but rather as part of an establishment. The domestic silver of Boston in the period 1680 to 1720 thus embodies Boston's central and independent role in the Anglo-American world, as it parlayed its commercial acumen rather than a single commodity to establish its prominence. After gaining control of the coastal carrying trade and taking the audacious step of minting their own coinage in order to facilitate the gathering of diverse local products during the third quarter of the 17th century, Boston leaders then used Spanish silver not to expand trade further, but to consolidate their own status within the port town. Melting down Spanish silver provided by ship captains, merchants, and adventurers, local craftsmen assisted by immigrant craftsmen fabricated a wide array of objects that identified and linked the commercial town's leaders. While the general styles of these objects followed English fashion, certain local details emerged that made the work distinctly Boston. The engravers favored heraldic engraving, which replaced embossing and chasing as the favored means of decoration. Specialists who cast parts, such as thumb pieces and terminals for tankards or handles for porringers, offered a line of options that were distinct from English work. And certain forms, such as tankards and porringers, enjoyed popularity far beyond that they had enjoyed in England. That many of these silver objects were then preserved, used, and handed down over generations, often with updated inscriptions, and not melted down, attests to the enduring value as powerful vessels of memory that highlighted the emergence of Boston as the major center in the early American colonies. Only in the 20th century did families release these objects, not to be melted down, but rather to become parts of institutional collections, particularly in the Boston area, to reaffirm Boston's premier role as a cultural center in colonial America. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Cooke. So we'll take some questions from the crowd now, but while you all get oriented and think of any questions you have, Professor Cooke, I would like to hear a little bit about any item that in your research that particularly stood out to you, whether it's the style or the significance of it.
I think probably a couple different objects from the ones that I showed tonight were significant. I think it's a Jeremiah two-handle bowl that's based on Portuguese types. For the longest time, people had said something about, oh, it looks Portuguese, but actually seeing some of the Portuguese examples in person and then finding that the trade with Portugal, that 70% of the Boston fish were sent to the Wine Islands in Portugal. That was the major port. They weren't sending things to England itself, and they were actually importing a great amount of tin glazed earthenware, ceramics, and then also thinking about this trade in silver, that it's really distinctive, far different than any kind of Anglo versions. So that to me was, I'd always heard about it sort of being Iberian, but then actually being able to be in Portugal and look at some of these examples in person, and then having that piece that came from the Phipps treasure from the Concepcion, which also is lobed in the same way, starts to really give you a sense of a different aesthetic.
Great. So we have a question from the group asking about when you talked about the borrowed coat of arms. Obviously, these were not, you said they had no relation, but they simply borrowed the ones with their same name. Were there any conflicts that arose given that?
Well, most of the stuff stayed local, so there weren't conflicts, and it's the advantage of being 3,000 miles away from authority. We have, and it's one of these things that really informs the whole book, is that we oftentimes tend to think with the Navigation Acts that everything had to go back to Britain, that Britain had a tight control. But it's what I was referring to as leakage in the Caribbean, and the fact that the British can't maintain control over the colonies here. It becomes really hard. And particularly if you've got entrepreneurial people who think of themselves as the revolution then ultimately points out, these are people who viewed themselves as British, not simply as colonists.
So I'm going to unmute Edward to ask a question.
In the context of the Monteith discussion, you made reference to Hawaii, as if I heard you correctly. I was just curious about whether there was any connection. I thought there was some mention of the Pacific as part of the trade, but
what they were doing was oftentimes getting things through Britain that came from South Asia, Southeast Asia, spices, and actually punch. Wine was from Portugal for the most part, and then France in the early 18th century. But when you get into punch in the early, like 17 teens, 20s, that is truly the first global beverage because it's got sugar from the Caribbean, it's got arak or another kind of liquor from South Asia. They've got gin. I mean, it's all these different, and then lemons from Iberia. All these things together. But I shouldn't have mentioned Hawaii.
I must have misheard. Thank you very much. Great presentation, Ned.
Thanks, Ed.
So we have a question from Stephen asking, do you have any thoughts as to what extent the reliance upon pirates who nabbed the silver and the merchants who relied upon it for their trade created a nexus of anti-authoritarians who were essentially becoming trained in independence and challenge to legal restraint? In other words, did silver help birth the revolution?
Great sort of thing. I think one of the things that has to be distinguished is that the classic age of piracy is actually only in the 1720s, 1730s, when you're talking primarily of these people who are truly individuals. In the 1680s, 1690s, a lot of them actually have they are privateers with specific state-driven, sort of they have a line of authority to a government, British, French, Dutch, whatever, that gives them that authority under that nation state to seize property of other states. So that actually is much more national competition at that point. And the kind of free agent piracy is later. So I always try to draw a distinction between privateers and buccaneers and then pirates. It all gets blended when you go to Disneyland and have Pirates of the Caribbean, but I mean, that such is the way we tend to sort of push things together. And to me, that was one of the real interesting kinds of separations, is the thinking about state-sponsored seizures versus private freewheeling work.
So we have a question from Melanie asking, how can you tell if a piece is made from coin silver? Can you tell where the coins were from?
You can't tell. I mean, Ethan Lasser, who's now at the MFA, who was at Harvard, was interested in doing a project with X-ray fluorescence to try to figure out trace elements, because silver is not pure silver. Oftentimes has a mixture of other ores in it. And this sort of X-ray fluorescence was started at Winterthur's conservation lab in the 1960s. But it's really hard to say something distinctively is being made out of Potosi silver versus Zapoteca silver, or is it French coinage? That's become harder because oftentimes you're just getting house blends as you go as well. I mean, it's one thing to sort of get coins directly from the treasure fleet, but oftentimes things keep getting added together and it ends up being quite mixed. I think people are still going to be asking these questions, but so far it hasn't really given any sort of pay dirt.
The next question is from Tiffany asking, what kinds of primary sources have been the most useful to you in the study of the circulation of silver and or the sourcing of it?
To me, it's, obviously you depend on a lot of specialist work like Patricia Kane here at Yale, producing an encyclopedia of Massachusetts silversmiths that comes out of a long tradition of John Marshall Phillips and Joe Says. I mean, silver has always been one of the real mainstays of the Yale Art Gallery's collection. So they've actually been able to pull together a lot of great primary documents, including going through court records and probate records in Massachusetts. In fact, it was my first introduction as an undergraduate, taking a seminar with Charles Montgomery in my junior year, that I first got access to some of those documents within the Art Gallery's collection. And I think it fueled my interest in this period and some of these subjects. But the other way in which I started to get interested is going through port records at the Guildhall Library in London, seeing what was coming into the port. That's where I found some of the flow of coinage and ingots from the Caribbean. So it's sort of pulling together probate inventories, court records, port records, things like that.
Those all sound fascinating.
And you got to learn, obviously, late 17th, early 18th century script.
Yes. Another question from Tom. How do silversmiths pay a sailor for captured Spanish silver coins? Do they trade an artifact weighing 12 ounces for 16 ounces of coins?
What you found is in inventories, they might have a value of 6 shillings an ounce or something like that. But by and large, people aren't paying cash for anything. And it's strictly a barter economy, or sort of taking something in to then add value and maybe produce something. So it'd be like Phipps, William Phipps, the person who parlays his connections with the Admiralty in Britain. I mean, he's born in Maine. He sort of sails out of Boston. He gets connected with some of the English officials. He's able to get funding from them, but then he has to pay from some of his 300,000 pounds. Part of that has to go back. And in fact, the apocryphal story is he helped bail out the English government at that point to pay for some of the wars that were preceding. But if coins are coming into Boston, they're not coming in that same huge quantity. It's oftentimes small bits. And the exchange of produce, I mean, remember, Boston has a population of about, say, 1,700. It's going to be probably around 13,000 people, but they're all on a little peninsula. And they're depending from the countryside for food, and then they're depending on the trade to bring in other necessary items. And so food, ship, chandleries, all this stuff are all interconnected. So you might actually have third or fourth party exchanges to have a silversmith get some of that silver. Then there are other times in which a client would provide the silver up front for a piece that was going to be fabricated. So the silversmith doesn't have to worry about the overhead kinds of costs of material.
And speaking of material, a question from Sylvia asking, you referred to silver as being called plate early on. That's not silver plate, right? In other words, how is this different from plated pieces rather than sterling?
Plate was the term that was used in the 17th and 18th century for silver objects. And in fact, the whole introduction of silver plate, that is putting a layer of silver over a base metal, is not really become a popular sort of endeavor until the late 18th century. Sheffield and in England, it becomes one of the real centers of it. But it's a kind of plate. It's not electroplating. It's something called fused plate, in which you actually are putting sheet silver over a base metal like copper, and then putting it through roller and some heat to try to adhere it. But these aren't, when you see plate in people's inventories and their a description of their property, they would talk about how many ounces of plate, and that's silver.
So another question from Tom. The early dram cup decorations look almost freehand, like Keith Harding. The later decorations look precise. Was there an aesthetic preference from casual decoration that gave way to a preference for realism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In some respects, that dram cup, which is the earliest dated piece of American silver, and it's here at the Yale Art Gallery, it's done through a chasing technique. And so it actually might be an indication of, I mean, Hull and Sanderson were trained in chasing techniques from London work. They didn't get to use it that often while they're doing other bits and pieces. And I would say that at that point, the paneling is more important than the floral decoration. So you're right in terms of thinking about that as being a little bit cruder. And that the later work, they have more specialists. That's when you've got the piece workers coming in who do nothing but chasing or nothing but engraving. And there's something about repetition and confidence that will come about with that kind of practice. And then on top of that, instead of having just sort of some vague memory, there are many more objects to look at to then start to approximate whether it's print sources. And this is what I was saying, you had this real proliferation of visual ideas that are printed book form, that are imported textiles, imported ceramics, you name it. One could actually make the same case in ceramic of the way in which tin glazed earthenware, which oftentimes is really hard to have precise floral decoration. If you think about Portuguese or Dutch tin glazed earthenware of the 1670s, it's kind of cloudy around the edge. And yet you look at some of the work coming out of Staffordshire when they are much more scientific in terms of the way they're transfer decorating, that becomes much more precise too. So I think you could talk about it in a variety of different ways, but I think your general sense of sort of the kind of rougher to the more refined is certainly true.
We have another question asking, you mentioned the Yale Art Gallery a few times. when we are all allowed to return, are there any particular things that you would recommend we check out in person?
I'd say between the MFA and the Yale Art Gallery, MFA in Boston, everything you saw tonight is probably in those two, just about those two collections. I mean, the Yale collection is really extraordinary for what Francis Garvin and John Marshall Phillips were able to acquire in the late 20s and 1930s. So, you know, just the Monteith, the Coney Monteith is here. That the two sugar box, the Winslow sugar box is here. The let's see, the skillet that Rouse engraved is here. The dram cup is here. You know, there's a caster by Hiller here. I mean, there's a lot you could, and it's all on display. So you could easily go down in part of the reinstallation from several years ago. There's a whole silver corridor you could look at.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah, I know. Don't we all?
Another question asking, I'm sorry, about the word repoussé, if you could elaborate on that.
So repoussé chasing, it's important to realize when you chase something, what you're doing, you're not removing metal, but you're using sort of small little chisels. They almost look like screwdriver blades, but they could be circular, they could have slight curves, they could be straight, but you end up tapping with a chasing hammer to push the metal in. And that's how that creasing for panels on the dram cup is done. But you could also push metal from the inside out by the use of a snarling iron, in which it basically comes into, and it's used on vessels primarily, but it's a stake that through vibration, it pushes the metal out in kind of a lumpy way. And then you would come back in and chase it to give it definition. And so when you have repoussé chasing, think of that as high relief work. It's manipulating the metal beyond in sort of two different dimensions. Key to all that, whether you're chasing or particularly when you're chasing, is to use a pitch or a wax on the inside of it, so you're not deforming the actual shape of it, but it gives a kind of soft backing so you could concentrate your chasing techniques.
And then we have a question from Anne asking, was there any fake silver that people tried to sell as silver during this time period?
Huh. Not that I've seen any indications were. I mean, this is why it's kind of interesting to think about in London or Bristol or various other London English centers, that you had assay office in which you struck 4 different hallmarks: a maker's mark, the assay office, that, in other words, it is of sufficient quality, and then a date mark, and then an English mark. In Boston, all you had to do was put all that was done was the maker's mark. I've never seen anything about sort of someone trying to pass off non-silver. You do find in the newspapers that start up in the early 18th century notices of silver that's stolen with maker's marks on it, and it includes the maker's mark on it as if that's sufficient to know this is the real thing.
Right. So that's all the questions I have in the chat. Do we have any other ones from everyone on video? You can wave at me if you don't use the raise hand function. I think we're all
getting better with chat and various other things.
Yes, but I think that's all for now. So thank you so much. I didn't realize how fascinating silver was. I need to go do some more reading now. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this talk with us today.
Well, I really appreciate, as I said, you doing this as part of the Yale Club's outreach, and maybe get more people doing it this way than coming to the library in New York. And I'm constantly thinking about the silver lining in all these endeavors that we're in. So I really appreciate you doing that, and also for the people tuning in during dinner hour.
Yes, of course. And thank you all for tuning in. We have a lot more events upcoming, so we hope to see you at some of them soon. Until then, stay home, stay safe, stay connected. We'll see you next time.
See ya.